that anyone, if they had the discipline and the vision, could furnish the mind with that which would make them capable of truly great communication and leadership.
Hello, and welcome to the Arts of Language podcast with Andrew Pudewa, founder of the Institute for Excellence in Writing, or as many like to say, IEW. My name is Julie Walker, and I'm honored to serve Andrew and IEW as the Chief Marketing Officer. Our goal is to equip teachers and teaching parents with methods and materials which will aid them in training their students to become confident and competent communicators and thinkers. So, wonderful man with the funny words. Wait, no, funny man with the wonderful words. That's what one student said about you. Your public speaking skills are famous.
Well, no need to flatter.
Well, I was just, this is a lead-in, of course, to our topic today, speaking. And I just think of all the surveys that were done, and I actually did a little research before I walked into our podcast studio today to find out how public speaking ranks as far as fears.
Oh.
And various surveys said 67% of Americans say that their number one fear is speaking. Other surveys said 33%. It's just kind of all over the map.
Yeah.
But we do have to acknowledge that standing up on the stage like you do, every convention season, every time you do instruction to a group of teachers, a lot of people just would be very fearful of that. And so knowing that speaking is something that we're fearful of, but yet something so important as far as language arts development, wow, how do teachers and parents help to cultivate speaking skills in their students?
Sure. Yeah. Last week, we talked a little bit about how listening is the foundation for speaking and reading and writing.
Right.
And thinking, of course, is the quintessential element throughout all of them. And I noted that we have two words, hear and listen. Okay. Hearing, listening. One is kind of accidental. We all do it. We all hear. The other is kind of intentional. We listen for something, to something. Interestingly, we also have parallel words when it comes to speak. Talk and speak. Mm-hmm. Talking, speaking. Everybody talks, right? It's very rare to meet a person who doesn't talk at all. And it's frequent to meet people who talk a lot. So everybody, unless you have a disability in that area, a brain injury, talks. Mm-hmm. But speaking does have that same kind of intentionality. You speak to someone. You speak about something. It's more of a transitive type of active verb. So, yes, how do we cultivate that? One of the stories I think you've probably heard me, I was at a friend's home in Chicago, and she has a bunch of antiques and stuff, which I don't really care much about. But on her wall, she had a very interesting little antique framed report card from I don't remember what year, 1904 or 6 or some very early 1900. And it had the list of all the subjects and then the letter grade for whatever student it was. I don't know if it was a relative of hers or some random person. What was interesting, of course, is there were some subjects missing.
Oh.
There was no social studies there. There was history and geography. They both got a grade. There was no grade for health, so I wondered, how do people stay healthy? But what was interesting was there was a subject with a letter grade called elocution. Elocution. This is a word that many Americans may not even recognize or know quite what it means. It's from the Latin verb loquor, meaning to speak, meaning to speak out. And so it was essentially the art of being able to stand in front of other people and speak well. So there's phases that you would go through in developing this skill, and these phases kind of correspond with the natural development of children.
Okay, so last week we touched on we spent a lot of time on preschool. Thank you. My grandchild, thanks you as well. Primary, and then elementary, middle school, high school. Are these the different phases then that you can go through with speaking?
You kind of can. I mean, there's no strict lines.
No.
But there are certain activities that become more appropriate as the children get older that do cultivate this elocution, this speaking skill. One of those overlaps, of course, with what we talked about last week in terms of the nursery rhymes, learning simple little poems and songs with enough repetition that you not just recognize it, but can actually reproduce it.
Okay.
So at a certain point, if a child has heard the same little poem or nursery rhyme enough times, that child will instinctively try to recite it, to tell it back to you. It's just an instinct. You don't even have to ask them or coach them to do it. They will naturally say what they've learned by ear because it's in their heart. You know, we learn by heart. Now we want to express. We want to share. We want to give back the thing we have.
So is this different than singing a song, or could it be similar?
Songs and poems are very similar in many ways because they're both language-based. They very often have some little narrative line or at least a theme that is connecting the ideas. Songs and poems are generally easier to learn and memorize and recite because they have predictable patterns. So there's a rhyme scheme and there's a rhythmic pattern that kind of narrows the possibilities of what word could come next. So it's actually easier to memorize poems and songs and to recite them than anything else. So what we notice is that young children can very easily do this.
Yes.
I have had literally 2-year-olds. Well, I haven't had my own 2-year-olds, but I have had people show me video clips of a 2-year-old reciting a short 2-line poem.
Right.
Usually, ooey gooey.
Which is the first poem in our linguistic development through poetry memorization course. I think it's one of our products with the longest meaning-packed title that you came up with.
Yeah, it's not very catchy, though.
No,
But linguistic development through poetry memorization.
Kind of says what it is we're trying to do here, which is trying to cultivate linguistic patterns. We're trying to develop linguistic patterns in children through poetry.
Sure. Well, what happens when young children, memorize a poem or a song? The words in the poem move into their active vocabulary because they're able to say that poem. They're able to say the individual words in the poem, and you're much more likely to hear a word from a poem that has been memorized come out in some conversational context. So you're building vocabulary. You're building syntax, right? Ways to put words into sentences, hopefully legally. One of the things I did when I selected the poems for the linguistic development through poetry memorization program was I wanted poems that were all going to be grammatically correct. I didn't want to use poems that put words together in ways that were too awkward or even not quite legal from a modern grammatical standard because part of the whole goal in doing that was to furnish the mind through the memorization of poetry. Many parents have discovered that children also can memorize scripture very easily. The Awanas program is notable for getting very large numbers of children all over the world to memorize quite an extensive collection of scripture verses. And so there's a lot of power in that.
And they start very young.
And they start very young and can continue it. We know our friends over at Classical Conversations have had memory work going on with the Foundations program that's really quite impressive when you realize that children can memorize and recite and do it not just competently but skillfully with a little bit of coaching, and not just for mom but actually in front of a whole room full of people.
Right.
And that moves you a little bit into the opportunity to practice some of those elocution skills, things that would be contributing to your grade on your report card in 1904.
Okay.
Which would be volume, changing your speed and pitch so that you're not speaking in a monotone, projecting to the back of a room, eye contact, appropriate use of hand gestures. All of these things can be modeled, practiced, improved over time.
Right. And when you say over time, I'm back to those 5 boxes. We're not talking necessarily about preschoolers here. We're talking about primary and older practicing these skills.
Sure, yeah, because they would have the opportunity to stand in front of others and recite things that they have memorized.
And be terrified, or maybe not so much because they're young and they like to show off a little bit.
It is interesting. I know from teaching music, it is a whole lot easier to get a 6-year-old to stand up and play a recital for the first time than to get a 16-year-old to stand up and play a recital for the first time. And I think the same is true for standing in front of people and reciting poems or giving speeches. It is easier to cultivate that aptitude at a younger age. And if you read books like Little House on the Prairie, Laddie, Anne of Green Gables, Little Breeches, almost any book about children and school in the 1800s, they would give you at least a little bit of a picture of how those children, as young as 6 years old, were responsible for huge chunks of memorized poetry, scripture, and in order to prove that they knew it, would stand in front of the whole class and recite it. And that became just a normal part of education as reflected on the elocution grade on the report card.
Yes.
There's even an expression. A lot of people have heard this expression if they've read books like those. You wouldn't have ever used it. You're not old enough. But it's the expression, say my lessons. Have you heard that one?
Yes.
Say my lessons. I have to go to school and say my lessons. So that was essentially how you proved you had learned what you were supposed to learn, is you would recite it.
Must have had very small classes. I can't imagine my friend who teaches middle school with her 35 students having all of those junior high students say their lessons.
Well, no, you wouldn't have everyone do it every time. And most of those vignettes are from a one-room schoolhouse that may have had 40, 50, even 60 students. So not everybody would do everything every day.
I see.
But when it was your turn, when you were ready, like so. Then, of course, once you get to a certain point, you could help children write their own stuff to memorize and deliver.
Okay.
So you would probably start with young children, songs, poetry, scripture, if you're so inclined. Continue that on all the way through. But say upper elementary, middle school, now you could actually write a speech and at first maybe read your speech to the people or read your paper. Although that can get kind of tedious because, people's face in the paper, they can't project out. They're not connecting with the audience. It can be a little bit dreary to listen to several children read their story out loud in a class.
I've been to conferences where the presenter is essentially just reading his or her paper.
Right.
It's like, can you just hand me that paper
Yeah.
so I can read it and go do something else?
Yeah. But a good speaker, you'll notice, they can have written it, but then they almost know it well enough that either they have it mostly memorized or they can reconstruct it as they go.
Right.
And this, of course, is where people find our keyword outline system so
Right.
very, very helpful. And we incorporate this right in Unit 1 and 2, where the kids have the notes from the source text, and then they look down at the paper, see their keywords, think of a sentence, look up, and then say the sentence they thought of to the group of people or to a partner or to a small class. So they look, think, remember, construct the sentence, look up, remember the sentence they constructed, and say it. Then they look at the paper, think what they're going to say, look up, remember, speak, and continue learning to speak from keyword outlines.
Right.
And this skill can go all the way through.
Right.
We start with here's your dictated source text, here's your Unit 1 paragraph. You take keywords from every sentence, you practice this. Take it into Unit 2, write it out if you want to. But we've had kids tell stories from their Unit 3 story sequence chart, 3-paragraph keyword outline in the same fashion. In fact, before I came in to record this podcast, I was working on a keyword outline for a talk that's a new talk I'm going to give this year at the conferences.
Nice.
And I kept realizing that I was putting more words than I needed, right? That I would, all those useless little words like and of and with and because. And so I generally would put something and then realize I don't need so many words and then delete the word, replace it with a comma or a space so that when I see those keywords, that tells me, this is the idea that I'm going to communicate next.
Nice.
So it's a way to sequence. So it carries over from, the grade 1 kid doing the keyword outline on an Aesop fable and then telling it to his class all the way to people, who operate in a professional public speaking environment.
Right.
So that keyword outline use of notes, or I would say the use of keyword outline notes, it gives you the best of both worlds.
Right.
You don't have to memorize the whole thing and run the risk of forgetting stuff, and you're not going to stand up there and just read what you wrote.
Right.
And you're going to be able to communicate with the aid of the notes directly to the people. And then you can skip stuff and add stuff and move it around as opportunity or the spirit moves.
Right. So let me just go through the steps now again. We've got the memorizing and reciting poetry and songs for the preschoolers, maybe doing a linguistic development through poetry memorization for the primary. For elementary, now we're doing keyword outline and doing little presentations.
Sure, and continuing with the poetry memorization. You never want to stop that.
Yes, exactly. So now we're getting into those feisty middle school years.
Right.
What do you do for them?
Well, you can continue doing what you're doing. You just you can do longer poems, right? Ones that are going to be more challenging. I know that Highlands Latin School, my friends who teach there, their 7th graders all memorize the entire poem Horatio at the Bridge, which, if I recall correctly, is 40 stanzas long.
Wow, yep.
And it's like a rite of passage for 7th graders to say, I memorized that whole thing, and then they recite it alone, and then they get a little certificate and a pin. And, it's a great thing to carry into adulthood, saying, I could do that, right? So increasing the length and sophistication. I think it's also wonderful to supplement the memorization of good and great poetry with excerpts from famous speeches.
Yep.
Because there's really nothing quite like learning the very words that Patrick Henry used, or the very short speech that Elizabeth I gave as she charged her troops to go off and fight against the overwhelming odds of the Spanish Armada. It puts you into history in a way that almost nothing else can. Which is why in level 5 of our linguistic development through poetry memorization, we added 20 excerpts of famous speeches, which aren't as easy to remember because they're not quite as predictable in terms of rhyme, scheme, and rhythmic patterns, but they stimulate the imagination, especially if you have read a little bit more about what was going on in that time or place in history.
You could actually do a history curriculum, write your own history curriculum based on the speeches that we selected for that. And I think we did them chronologically, didn't we?
I think we tried to. Yes, we did. And so that's a great thing to do. And children used to do that too in middle school and high school. In fact, in some schools I have seen the high school will do a declamation competition, which is essentially you memorize someone else's really famous speech and you practice it and practice it and practice it until you can give that speech effectively as if you were that person.
Oh, okay.
And I had the privilege of judging a declamation competition not too long ago at one of the classical high schools here in Tulsa. And I was quite amazed. I mean, some of these speeches were 9-10 minutes long.
Wow.
And very intense as well. The ones that won had, of course, the combination of content value, of emotional impact, and of historical significance,
Mm-hmm.
and of course, a very polished delivery.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's, in a way, combining the skill of memorization, the many different aspects of the skill of elocution, along with kind of a bit of drama and acting,
Right.
which is also a great opportunity for middle and high school kids to be part of a dramatic production.
Right.
You've had kids in drama, I think.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And memorizing their lines, and that was, definitely got the whole family involved.
Yeah, and we did that for years too. We had a Central Coast Homeschool Theater Ensemble, and so almost my 5 younger kids all got a chance to be in plays and sometimes even take a lead role. And it's funny when your kids are in a play, your home becomes kind of a constant rehearsal zone.
Absolutely.
And so there's a richness to the language there as well. And, of course, many schools and the homeschool leagues include speech and debate. And this is very formal competition for which there are concrete guidelines and rules and formats that must be followed, but a wide variety of things that kids can do. So I would strongly recommend if you are teaching in a school and you can start a forensics club or a speech club, that'd be a tremendous gift to your school if you don't already have one.
Right.
If you do, encourage your students to get involved. Oftentimes, you can travel to other places to compete with other schools. Mock trial or moot court, sometimes it's called. That's kind of a combination of memorized stuff along with knowing information and having to speak impromptu a bit and some acting skills all thrown in together. And very often moot courts will have a competition in an actual courthouse.
Nice.
And they'll ask judges, real judges, to come and be judges in the moot court. And a couple of my kids did that and had a very good time with that. I was very impressed with that. Then, of course, there's values debate and policy debate.
Right.
And, of course, we have materials.
Yes, we
we've
do.
published in cooperation with the NCFCA.
Right.
Available for all the speech events and all the debate events.
Well, I want to come back to that in just a second. I want to just, give a shout out to that speaker who put together that course called Speech Boot Camp, something like that.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, and that was you, of course.
Well, it was interesting.
Tell that story, yeah.
Our debate club in California had grown gradually over many years. And so for a few years, I did what I called a speech boot camp, which was in August before school started for kids who were interested in joining the debate club. And so it was kind of like just introduction. Okay, here you come in. You're going to do 4 speeches in 2 weeks. You're not going to have time to memorize them perfectly, but that's okay. You are going to give 4 speeches in 2 weeks. You're going to critique each other's speeches. We're going to give a little bit of instruction. And if at the end of that you kind of like it and want to learn more and do better, right, join our debate club.
Right.
So it was kind of a recruiting device for the debate club,
Right.
as well as a filtering device. And then when I said, oh, sorry, I'm moving to Oklahoma, I said, well, who's going to do speech boot camp?
Right.
I said, well, I'll do it one more time and we'll record it.
Right.
So that's how that video came into being. So it's a self-introduction speech, and then there's a story speech, there's a descriptive speech, and a persuasive speech.
Right.
And so I go over the model and for that. And what I did was I brought in people who were very experienced, had years of high school level speech and debate under their belt to come in and do a demonstration for each of those. So the younger kids, who were probably all 12 to 14, had a chance to see what a polished version of that would look like before they had to do it. And boy, have we had the stories. I would say every conference I go to, someone comes up and says, well, I bought that speech boot camp and my son, he really, really didn't want to do it.
Right.
But after, the 4 weeks or the month or 2 that we did it, now he wants me to start a whole speech club. What should I do next?
Start a speech club.
So it is a case where in acting, they call it the bug bit ya. A little bit of success in an experience can cause you to like that and want to do more of it.
Right. What I love about these products that we have The first two we've talked about, linguistic development through poetry memorization and speech boot camp, gives kids the confidence and therefore the competence to become good communicators.
Yeah,
And I love that.
I think so. And if I could finish up with probably what to me is the most dramatic example that I have ever heard, that I know of, in all of history, of the incredible power of memorized language to create true intellect and leadership ability. That would be the story of Frederick Douglass.
Yes.
You remember Frederick Douglass?
I was, as you were describing what you were going to talk about, I was predicting. Yep.
So most people are familiar with him because of his book, his autobiography. But to me, the most interesting thing about him was not in his autobiography, but in a biography that someone else wrote about him. So when you think of his situation, so he was born into slavery. He was separated from his parents at a very young age. He was forced under brutal conditions to work almost all his waking hours in hard labor for his entire childhood, really. It was illegal to teach in that time and place. It was illegal to teach a slave to read or write or educate them in any form at all. And I think you could say, short of being chained in a closet, he had the worst possible education, the worst possible language development environment that you could imagine.
Right.
Yet he became, I would argue, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, orator that America has ever seen.
Right.
You might argue that some of his predecessors, like Patrick Henry, were greater in terms of their orations and public speaking. But I know of no one from his time forward, certainly no one in the modern era, who wrote speeches with such incredible eloquence and delivered them with such passion and power. Of course, I have only read his speeches. I did not hear him personally.
Right.
But people attest to the power, conviction. And if you go read his speech, it's usually called What to the Slave is the 4th of July. It's amazing. It blow your mind. You or I could never, ever write something like that. So it kind of raises the question, how is it that a person with such a horrible childhood and education and formation during the most important first 12 years of his life, how did he become such an incredible orator? Well, we know because someone asked him once and said, Mr. Douglass, how did you become such a powerful speaker?
Yes.
And this was his answer. He said, well, as a free man, one of the first books I owned was The Columbian Orator. I believe this book was published in 1795, if my memory is correct. And it's not a huge book, but it is maybe 100 pages. It is a collection of the greatest speeches in all of history, from Cicero to Augustine to Luther and Shakespeare to Patrick Henry. Really, the greatest that had ever been said or translated into English in this one volume. And his answer was, I committed them all to memory.
Wow.
He memorized this whole book of speeches.
He must have been brilliant, really.
Well, he probably had some pretty good neurology.
Yeah.
But more than that, look at all what he had to overcome.
True.
I mean, certainly his vocabulary had to expand hugely for him to even be able to read those things, let alone then use them. So in reading and memorizing these speeches, it furnished his mind, not just with the vocabulary, not just with the beautiful syntax and the variety of eloquent ways to put words together, not just with the schemes and tropes and allusions that make the rhetoric powerful, but with the very seminal ideas of justice and right and truth. And to me, that is just so remarkable that anyone, if they had the discipline and the vision, could I love that expression, furnish the mind with that which would make them capable of truly great communication and leadership, as Frederick Douglass clearly demonstrated to the world.
Yeah, incredible.
So it's a big spectrum. Memorize nursery rhymes.
Join NCFCA and do policy debate and values debate with the curriculum that they've developed that we now publish.
Yeah, we can't do values and policy at the same time. You have to pick one or the other. But you could do one or the other, and then you could also do other speech events at the same time.
Yes.
Platform speeches, limited prep speeches, dramatic interps.
And our goal here is to decrease the number of people who report that the fear of that public speaking is their number one fear, right? Or something like that.
Well, more than that, I don't really care how many people are afraid of public speaking. But I do think what we would like to see is more intelligent dialogue happening, both in our homes and schools, but also in the greater public as well. And what's exciting about furnishing the mind and then practicing the skill of public speaking, of rhetoric, if you will, it also allows you to think better. It's going to also, I think, cultivate a respect for other people whose ideas you may disagree with, but because you're operating at a much higher level than just, name-calling and blackballing and saying dumb things. So, I would like to see the American people be able to appreciate a debate more like Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln than what we often see around election time on our networks.
Yes, yes. And not just America.
The world.
The world. Absolutely. Well, thank you, Andrew.
It's always a pleasure.
Thanks so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more, you can subscribe to this podcast in iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher, or just visit us each week at iew.com/podcast. Until then, on behalf of Andrew Pudewa and the team at IEW, I thank you for allowing us to partner with you on your journey toward better listening, speaking, reading, writing, and thinking.